Welcome, everyone. Today, I'm Paolo Gaudiano. I think most of you know me, but I'll mention a few words about myself. I always assume that there are people that have not heard me speak before and that there are some that have. I am going to talk today about some new work. It's building on work that I've already been doing for a number of years, but there is a bit of a new slant that partly reflects the current state of affairs as well as reflecting some expansions of the work that I've already been doing. And we call it the Measuring Inclusion and Merit for Efficiency, or MIME framework. And the idea is really to, again, acknowledge some of the realities of what is happening today in diversity and inclusion, but also to build on what we've already built rather than trying to throw it out and start over again. And as I like to do in all of the talks, for those of you that have heard me speak, I do this every time. Before I start to talk about the content, I like to address what I call jokingly the white elephant in the room, which is me. What am I doing talking to you about diversity, equity, and inclusion, given that I happen to be white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, no disabilities. So I have all the privilege in the world. And the way that I got into the space was a little bit unusual. I like to joke with people that before getting into DEI, I've done both rocket science and brain surgery, which is kind of true in the sense that my master's degree was in aerospace engineering and actually did some projects that had to do with sending experiments up on the space shuttle. This is back in the 1980s. And then I got a PhD in computational neuroscience. I've actually have worked on brains. And then I left academia and became an entrepreneur. And I spent about 15 years between 2001 and 2015 being an entrepreneur, working on solving complex problems for primarily corporations, but also government agencies, foundations, a very, very wide range of problems that all shared a commonality, which is trying to understand the link between the individual and the collective. So whether it was a customer in a marketplace or an employee in a company or a sailor on a ship or a driver on a highway, we built computer simulations that help to essentially understand these complex systems, if you will, quantify them and manage them. And then in 2015, I had this, what I call the DI light bulb moment. Actually, back then it was just DNI. I was sitting in a conference. I was personally very interested in diversity and inclusion, but I always felt that, look at me, what can I do? I'm not an activist. I'm just a white dude. But I would go often to whenever there was a conference, if there was a session on diversity or inclusion, I would go there. And I remember sitting in one of the sessions and pondering the striking difference between the detailed experiences that people shared that happened to them because of their skin color, because of their gender, because of sexual orientation, and when it came to solutions, it was like, oh, we need to dismantle systemic racism. And, we need to change the way corporate America works. And one day, as I was contemplating this gap between the very detailed individual experiences and what was happening at the macroscopic level, I thought, wait a second, this is what I've been doing. By then, I'd been doing it for more than 25 years in a variety of guises. And I thought maybe I can apply my work to these ideas and to maybe to quantify the impact of what happens when companies are more diverse and inclusive and how that actually impacts the success of the company. And so that led me to launching Aleria and ARC, which is the 501c3. Also have done some work on the academic front. And then eventually a lot of the work culminated in this idea of measuring inclusion and the book that I published late last year called Measuring Inclusion, in which I talk about in the subtitle, I don't know if you can read it, but it's higher profits and happier people without guesswork or backlash. So the point being, I really wanted to point out that it's possible to marry those two things, making more money and making your employees happier. And I also, because of the fact that I could already see when I started writing the book more than 2 years ago, that the backlash was coming, I wanted to make sure that I addressed that front and center. Now, the work that I'm going to talk about today is a bit of an evolution, and actually want to acknowledge somebody that just joined, my good friend and off-time collaborator, Cynthia Overton. This was the picture that we took. What was it, last year at Black Women Talk Tech or Roadmap to Billions? It was sometime
One of those
recently.
conferences, yeah.
Yeah, and so I have some colleagues, and by the way, I'm not sure if Francesca is here. She's not here right now. I have a couple of colleagues, Francesca, Chibin, and other people that have helped me along the way. Cynthia and I have had kind of a different kind of relationship where we've collaborated, not in the same company, and now we've been spending a lot of time talking about ideas and really thinking about how do we frame some of the work that I've done with some of the amazing work that she's done, and really bringing our very different, sometimes very different perspectives together into something more tangible. And that's really what led to this idea of what I call the MIME framework. And so in the presentation, I'm going to tell you just super briefly one slide about what is the point and the idea of the MIME framework. And then I need to spend some time on a bit of background. So I'm gonna spend several minutes on this idea of the DEI versus MEI debate. If you're not familiar with MEI, I'll mention what that is, but it's basically about meritocracy as and being seen as a counterpoint to diversity and inclusion. And I also want to talk a bit about equity, because equity in the way that we mean it in DEI has kind of become a bit of a lightning rod, in some ways even more so than diversity. And then I'm going to, in order to explain the MIME framework, for those of you that have not heard me speak about measuring inclusion, I will spend about 5 at most 10 minutes talking about measuring inclusion. For those of you that have heard me speak about it before, it'll be a bit of a repeat. And then I'll talk about how to measure merit. And this is also something that I've already been working on. I called it something a little bit different, but I hope you'll see how it fits into that. And then kind of wrap up by putting it all together into this kind of of this framework that I call the MIME framework. And one of the things that I want to start again is to talk about why are we doing this and why are we doing it now. As you've probably seen, there have been a lot of panic in the, not just panic, but the DI field is literally on fire in a negative way, not like, hey, it's on fire. It was on fire in a good way 5 years ago. Now it's a complete disaster. And I'm seeing a lot of people that are scrambling to rename, change labels, rebrand, also coming up with ideas for new frameworks, the FAIR framework and this and that. And a lot of it feels like we're fishing for new ideas. And one of the things that I'm very proud of is the fact that I've been building something for the last 10 years. I wrote about the backlash in 2018. I saw it coming. And so I like to think that the work that we're doing is really a little bit different in the sense that we start by recognizing and acknowledging both the strengths and the weaknesses of both sides of the debate. And I think that on both sides, people have said, we have said some really silly things, and we're hanging on to ideals that sometimes are not necessarily backed by evidence the way that they should be. And the idea is to recognize that as much as there's this polarization and this hatred, the reality is that there is a lot of shared aspirations and a lot of commonality in what we're all trying to achieve, and really to leverage data and analytics to move beyond the rhetoric and to reduce the polarization. And that's really why we felt, and Cynthia and I have been having a number of conversations about this, and also working, as I said, with my colleagues, Francesca and Chibin and others, and build on the progress of what we've already done with measuring inclusion, while recognizing that we're in a really, really strange time, and that's putting it mildly, and that we have to be keenly aware of the current political situation, of the fact that there are executive orders that are basically shutting down anything that looks or smells like DEI, and that these are expanding all the time to try to eliminate not just what is supposed to be illegal discriminatory practices, but literally anything that even remotely resembles aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as much as I think it's terrible, it's disgusting, it's motivated by things that really have nothing to do with the work that we are trying to do, the fact of the matter is it's a reality that we have to deal with. And so let me start by talking about this DI versus MEI debate, because I think that a lot of times in the heat of the discussion, we lose sight of some of the, again, both the strengths and the weaknesses, and how we can leverage those to understand better what we need to do and how to move forward. So what is the DI versus MEI debate? Well, I would say that the MEI terminology started in June of 2024, when Alexander Wang, who's the CEO of a company called Scale, it's an AI company, he wrote a blog in which he said, pardon me, Scale is a meritocracy, and we must always remain one. And he went on to say that I think that our guiding principle should be MEI, merit, excellence, and intelligence. So not DI, but MEI. And that was immediately latched on by fairly visible people like Elon Musk, who, when Alexander Wang posted his blog on Twitter, Elon Musk actually said, great. And as you can imagine, when Elon Musk says that what you're doing is great, it immediately catches on fire. And then Trump started to talk about MEI. And so MEI became it became literally some conservative groups especially were using it to say, oh, this is the antidote to DI ideology. It's the best thing on the planet. This is what we all need to do. Now, I'm going to spend, if you come to my next webinar, which was supposed to be my previous webinar, and want to learn more about some of these discussions, I have more slides specifically, but I do want to talk a bit about the notion of meritocracy, because I think that at the heart of it, we talk about things without necessarily really asking ourselves what they mean. So what is a meritocracy? Now, this definition, there are lots of definitions, but they all basically boil down to the idea that individuals should be rewarded in advance based on their abilities, their performance, their effort, and not on extraneous factors, which today often meritocracies use as the counterpoint to identity first approaches. And so in this particular definition, they say, well, it shouldn't have anything to do with your gender, your age, your ethnicity, your social background. Now, superficially, if you don't think about the negative way in which it's being used, this is not an unreasonable viewpoint, right? I mean, in a way, what the DI has been saying is exactly this. It's like, look, just because you happen to be Black or gay or have a disability, you should not be discriminated against. You should be able to have the same opportunity to advance and to be rewarded, et cetera, et cetera. But unfortunately, the way that meritocracy has been implemented in reality is far from this ideal. And in fact, I am as guilty as anyone of attacking meritocracy. And I wrote an article back in 2018 in which I said meritocracy is a chimera. It's kind of an illusory, imaginary beast. And basically, the reason why I criticize meritocracy is because I said, look, it makes a lot of really questionable assumptions. For example, great idea to be rewarded based on your ability, performance, and effort, but who defines those terms and how are they measured? And is it something that you can actually quantify and say, well, yeah, you truly do deserve this one, and I've measured it, and in fact, you are meritorious of getting the raise or getting the new project or getting the promotion that you get. And unfortunately, the reality of typical meritocracies is that whoever decides on the definitions and criteria is likely to inject their own both conscious sometimes and unconscious biases. And the result of that, because you don't see a lot of consistent metrics, you end up getting a very qualitative system in which you're basically rewarding people for being similar to the people that are making the decisions about what constitutes a meritocracy. And this is very dangerous. And there's a wonderful book that came out now several years ago by Emily Chang called Brotopia, in which she talks about essentially meritocracy. And she talks about the fact that while giving the illusion of fairness, the idea of a meritocracy actually leads to a rich getting richer dynamic. It builds on and it amplifies existing biases, and it reduces the representation of talented people from underrepresented groups. So without metrics and without any kind of checks and balances, a meritocracy is just a self-fulfilling and self-sustaining system that exacerbates systemic disparities. Now, the problem is that people like me who attack meritocracy, we basically attack meritocracy based on the assumption that unbridled and unchecked meritocracy is a bad thing. But to somebody that's hearing it, it sounds like we're saying meritocracy as a principle is a bad thing. But I think that we can all agree that as a principle, meritocracy is not a bad thing. It's just the way that it's often been implemented. So we took a word, and in DI, a lot of people criticize the idea of meritocracy. And we took that because, based on kind of our own experiences. And that is a very dangerous mistake to make. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the script and talk about equity. Equity has become, in some ways, as you will see in a moment, even more of a political lightning rod than diversity itself. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But I think that this is another area where we've made a huge mistake in the field of DEI, because we have focused on equity by thinking about the things that we care about, which unfortunately in some cases have been perceived by the other side as having literally the opposite meaning to what we intended. But I think that one of the big mistakes that we've made is that when we've had discussions, and these are probably the three most famous sketches that are being used by people in the space of DI to talk about equity and to compare or to distinguish between the idea of equality and equity, right? So we see the picture of the kids or the people trying to watch a baseball game from behind the fence, and equality would be you give them all the same size crate. Equity would be that you give them crates depending on their height so they can all watch the game. Or there's the one about the kids trying to get apples from the apple tree, and the apple tree is tilted, and so one kid can get the apple, the other one can't, and so you give them ladders, but they cannot be the same height. One of them is high and you can't see it behind the other one, but it's like, oh, you should even invest money and straighten out the tree so that both kids can have the same opportunity. And then I think it was the UN that came out with this drawing of the idea of equality versus equity. Oh, well, if you give everyone the same size bicycle, then somebody who's in a wheelchair can't use it. Somebody who's too tall will be uncomfortable. Somebody who's too small will be uncomfortable. Now, here's the problem with all of these. All of these assume that what we care about is fairness and justice. We want all these people to have the same experience. But here is the problem. We never really bothered to think about the people that we're trying to convince, which are who? They're business leaders. They're people whose job is to make money. So here is one of the ways that I like to poke fun at these definitions. If I am the owner of the baseball field, why the hell are these kids not paying for tickets? Who is it? Why should I waste money giving them crates so they can watch the game for free? It makes no sense. And why are these damn kids stealing all my apples? Why should I waste money and time giving them tall ladders so they can go and eat my apples? It makes no sense. And even this one, right? I've made a funny picture with ChatGPT. I said, look, if your goal is to build a company, to build a successful team, why do you need to do this? Is this the kind of racing team that you're building? Right? I got ChatGPT. I thought this was a very funny picture. So think about it, right? From the point of view of a business leader, the examples that we've been using to argue for equity are they're not just falling on deaf ears, they're kind of counter to what these people actually want. And this is why equity has become a bad word. And I think one of the best examples of that is that I'm sure you all heard that there was the whole to-do, Costco was praised because they basically the board of Costco voted or they asked voters to vote against a proxy statement or a request, a shareholder proposal, in which was basically described as an anti-DI proposal. And what I want to show you is a very, very important piece of this anti-DI proposal, in which the language that they use, they talk about the fact that Costco had DI initiatives, and those are risky. They create a lot of risk for shareholders, and now they've renamed them, but really they're doing the same thing. And they say the renamed program still openly expresses a commitment to equity, which means equality of outcome, not opportunity. To people who are against DI, the idea of equality of outcome is a negative thing. Now, you might say, how is this humanly possible? How can equality of outcome be turned into a negative thing? And I'm going to give you a very quick example, which again, I will talk about in much more detail next week for those that care to join, which is a really, really interesting experience that I had of a situation in which somebody gave an analogy that was almost identical to another analogy that I've heard. And these two analogies lead to diametrically opposite conclusions having to do with equity. And let me show you what the analogies are. You may have heard people in the DI space talk about the idea of a foot race. And there are various versions of this. Or some people talk about, imagine there's a foot race, and at the beginning, some of the runners are held back, or maybe some of the runners' blocks are farther back than some of the others. Or like in this case, maybe some of the runners have obstacles along the course. Would this be a fair race? No. So clearly, it's not enough to remove the obstacles after the fact. What you would need to do is that you would need to slow down the runners that got in the lead unfairly because they had extra privileges, so that the other ones have a chance to catch up and then have a more fair race. Now, to me and to everybody else that has used these analogies, that sounds entirely reasonable. Until last year, I was in a part of a debate of a pro-DI, anti-DI person, and the anti-DI person gave an analogy. He said, imagine you're watching a race, and some of the racers are winning, and the judges come out and they don't like that because it's unfair outcomes. So they stop the racers in the front to make sure that everybody ends up the same way. This is what equity is all about. It's equality of outcomes. They want to slow down the best racers so that everybody can catch up. Now, I would submit to you that if that was a situation, you would also agree that it's unfair. It would be completely unfair to stop the faster racers so that the other ones can catch up. And I don't think that any of us in DI want that, right? But you can see how a slight change in the description and in the assumptions that you're making can lead to diametrically opposite conclusions. I'm going to dismantle this example and explain why both analogies are actually profoundly not flawed, but they reflect some flawed assumptions. I will do that in the next seminar on the 4th, but I don't want to spend much time on this one because I really want to talk. I want to get more to the point of why this leads to the whole MIME framework. Now, what I hope you will all agree is that ultimately we all, and when I say all, I mean the people that are against DI and the people that are for DI, we all want the same things. What do we want? If someone is qualified for a job, they should have the same opportunity to be hired as anyone else, regardless of their personal traits, right? I think that this is what, a lot of the white people who are complaining about reverse discrimination are saying this is not happening. right? And I know Torrin is here, and he's probably going to, torch me for saying reverse discrimination, and that's a whole other, yes, it's a stupid concept. Unfortunately, that's what people say. They say reverse discrimination. It's a silly idea because it's either discrimination or not discrimination. But the notion that white people are being discriminated against is what they've been complaining about because they want this to be true, just like we want anyone who's qualified to be able to get that job. At the same time, once you get in the company, you want to make sure that if somebody's performing their role, they should be able to advance and be compensated fairly, regardless of the personal traits. I think that we would all agree that these are things that would be highly desirable. And hiring, advancement, and retention policies should maximize the probability of success of an organization. I think that this is something that we often forget to include. It's that next step, because the first two statements are good for individuals. But if you're trying to convince a leader, you need to also be able to show not just that you've chosen the right candidate, but that this candidate actually succeeded, was able to do their work, and generated money for you. And I'm going to argue that both sides of the fence forget that, because very often what meritocracy ends up turning into is really just candidate selection. Oh, you have a better resume. It would be unfair not to hire you just because you are not gay or whatever the case might be, right? Yes, that would be unfair, but that doesn't really answer the question, is this person actually going to be the best person in the job once they get hired? And many companies just kind of forget to check that, right? So that's something that I think we need to be very careful about, is to think about the long-term implications. So how do we take what seem to be completely opposite views that clearly have a shared set of beliefs, but somehow they get interpreted in two completely different ways? How do we do that? And by the way, one of the things that occurred to me is that, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this, but people in the, what I would call, and I kind of almost hate calling it the pro-DI and anti-DI, because it sort of reinforces that polarization, but that's kind of the reality of the way that things are right now. But so when you look at people who are vehemently against DI, they have used the term ideology to describe DI. In fact, some people call it the de-ideology or IDE. They make jokes about, it being an ideology. Now, what is an ideology, right? An ideology, and this is, again, one of many definitions. I forget what dictionary I got this from. An ideology is a coherent system of ideas that relies on a few basic assumptions about reality that may or may not have any factual basis. Now, some people who argue against DI have argued that this is the case, that, there are these ideas, but in reality, we're not seeing that they're working, and it's not entirely clear, and it's these correlations, but are they really representing causality, et cetera, et cetera. However, by the same exact token, I would argue that meritocracy is way more of an ideology than it is an actual theory. Why? Because it's very, very lean on metrics. How many companies actually measure merit? How many companies actually confirm that they are a meritocracy? And what we need to do, I think, from both sides of the fence, is that we need to move beyond words. We don't need more definitions. We need quantitative frameworks and meaningful data. And what I would urge you to do is that when you hear people in DI that are coming up with, oh, let's come up with different words, let's talk about belonging and access and justice, great. But let's understand in a quantitative, replicable, measurable way what we actually mean. And if we can't do that, we're just throwing more words into the salad spinner, which is not going to solve any problems. It's going to create more polarization. So that's what led me, and with, again, conversations with Cynthia and a number of other people, to this idea of measuring inclusion and merit for efficiency. Now, clearly, we are paying attention to the current political climate, but as I will explain later, we're not just simply hiding behind the rock and changing names. We still believe that measuring inclusion is absolutely crucial to the success of any organization. And as you will see in a moment, we think that measuring merit is also absolutely crucial to the success of an organization. And we happen to think that efficiency, since we have, our beloved Doge, and well, now Elon Musk presumably is no longer going to be involved with that, but efficiency is a big deal. Efficiency is essentially another word for performance, right? So we feel that one good way to frame this is to think about how you can measure both inclusion and merit to ensure that there is efficiency in the company. So I'm going to now spend about 7, 8, 9 minutes talking about doing a quick review of measure inclusion. Those of you that have heard me speak about measure inclusion, you've seen these slides many times. So apologies for those of you that have not. I'll try to go fairly quickly, but hopefully it's pretty clear. Based on the work that my colleagues and I have done for about 10 years now, we have definitions of the 3 terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that are fairly different from the definitions that are typically out there. In particular, I like to say that inclusion as an organization, inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get, and equity is what you want. And the way that I define first, or the way that I explain what I mean by the first definition, is let's look at inclusion. I talk about this hypothetical team. I invite people to imagine a perfect team in which everybody's working at their absolute peak and they all work really well together. And then I ask, what happens if one of the members of the team is unable to perform at their peak? Clearly, the performance of the team will decline. If something happens to a second member of the team that also interferes with an ability to perform, not only will the team's performance decline further because of the loss of productivity of the second person, but now the rest of the team is going to have to pick up the slack. They may be late on a deadline. They may no longer get the most prestigious jobs, and they will get really frustrated. And the entire team's performance can decline very dramatically. And the punchline of this is that I've said nothing about gender, race, sexual orientation, diversity, but there is a very, very powerful conclusion, which is that anything that an organization does that causes any of its employees to underperform because of personal traits impacts the entire organization adversely. And this is what I use to explain to leaders that they can't just think of diversity and inclusion as some bolt-on, some nice to have. They have to realize that everything that they do to their people impacts their performance, impacts their success. And the key to that, and where inclusion comes into play, is that ultimately, what influences the performance of those people, those stick figures? What makes them more or less satisfied, more or less frustrated? Well, we know that satisfaction is very, very closely tied to your performance, both in terms of productivity, in terms of the quality of work, and also in terms of your retention rates. And so what makes you satisfied at work? Well, it's everything that happens to you in terms of your ability to use your skills, your ability to balance your personal life with your work, your ability to be compensated properly, you're having the autonomy to make decisions. And the key that explains what I mean when I say that for a company or an organization, inclusion is what you do, is to recognize that if people have different experiences because of their identity traits, they will have different levels of satisfaction. And so inclusion, to me, is essentially at the heart of satisfaction, in recognizing that inclusion is about ensuring that people, regardless of their identity, are able to have the same kinds of experiences across all of these sorts of things that happen to you in the workplace. And if you're not inclusive, if you're not inclusive as an organization, you will see different levels of satisfaction. And what I've been able to show through my research is that not being inclusive has 2 negative consequences on a company. First, it reduces the diversity of the company. And second, it reduces the financial performance of the company. And the way that I do that is by, and again, many of you have seen this many, many times already, but I've built these computer simulations. This has been my bread and butter since my PhD days, building computer simulations. In this case, it's a computer simulation of a simple company with 4 layers of people, from entry-level managers, VPs, and executives. For simplicity, there are only 2 kinds of people, yellow and blue. Think of yellow as being women, blue as being men. We can capture any kind of diversity, but you'll see the point that I'm trying to make here. When we run the simulation, we see that under most reasonable sets of assumptions, you find that as the simulation runs, you always retain balance up and down all the levels. So you could see people kind of getting promoted. You could see some people leaving, turning gray and leaving the company. But the company always stays roughly 50-50. If you take the simulation and you introduce a bias, specifically, if you assume that when it comes to promotion time, the men will be slightly more likely to get promoted, and I jokingly say, not that that ever happens in the real company, right? But what if we simulated exclusion in the organization? And when we do that, we find that lo and behold, you start with a company that is 50-50 all the way up and down. You change one parameter, you rerun the simulation for the equivalent of 5 years, and this is what it looks like. It looks very much like what you see in the real world, where the top is dominated by men, and then you get kind of this pyramid And at the bottom, you have actually more women than men. And with my colleague Qibing Zhang, we've actually written an academic paper in which we use that simulation to show that we can capture with a very high degree of accuracy the level of promotion bias. In other words, the relative probability of a male getting promoted rather than a female compared to a female. And we can show that for all kinds of industries for which we had data from McKinsey and Lean In. So that proved that inclusion drives diversity, but I also claim that inclusion drives performance. And I'm going to do a sleight of hand and say, well, it drives efficiency. Again, efficiency is kind of one way of thinking about performance. Ultimately, it's about how the company is doing. And the way, and Erica is asking, what is the input for the promotion bias? In this case, it's a parameter. Basically, I'm saying if there is a bias, and I'm going to talk a bit more about what that means later, but basically it's an assumption. It's saying what would happen if there was a bias. The bias could be due to anything. It could be people being rude to women. It could be that they're simply say you're not as qualified. It could be that, oh, I'm not going to do your performance review for another 6 months. Or it could be that I'm doing your performance review and I'm not doing it fairly. It's the cumulative impact of all of those factors that is somebody's, that's interesting. Paolo is requesting to record the computer. I'm Paolo. That's weird. Okay, well, I just got a request the permission to record, and I've been recording, I hope, for 30 minutes. So hopefully it's been recording. But anyway, so in addition to skewing the diversity, what I was able to show is that if you track the level of satisfaction of the men and of the women in the simulation, you find that because the women are getting passed over for promotions more frequently than the men, their level of satisfaction is lower. So the men are very satisfied and the women are much less satisfied. Now, what's going to happen to these women? Just like the stick figures in the early analogy, they're going to be less satisfied, which means that they're going to produce less, which means that you as a company are making less money. But they're also going to be less likely to stay, which means that you're also going to be paying more money to replace these employees that are leaving unnecessarily. And this is why in the past I've argued that not only is inclusion is what you do and diversity is what you get, but equity is what you want. Why is that the case? Well, because if you have a gap in some measure, in this particular case, I'm looking at satisfaction, but it could be other measures, and I'll talk about that in the next part of the talk, which is about merit. But so if you have inequities in some measure of, let's say, satisfaction, that is costing you money. And on my website, on our website, you can find a calculator that estimates for a typical company how much money they're likely to be losing because of the fact that their level of inclusion is, well, they don't have the same level of experience or inclusion for all groups in the organization. And those, by the way, are big numbers. We estimate that a typical company loses around 20 to 30% of their net profits. Now, the way that we measure inclusion inside an organization is that we basically recognize that inclusion is a bit like health. You don't see inclusion, you tend to see exclusion. You tend to notice when something negative happens to you. And it turns out, if you've heard one of my talks, that this has some very interesting implications. For example, the recognition that just like health, for the people that are very healthy, don't know a lot about diseases and surely don't know how to cure them. The same is true for people that are very included. They don't understand exclusion. They don't know how to fix it, which unfortunately in most companies, that means the leaders. So the leaders of typical organizations are the least qualified to understand exclusion or to know what to do about it. Luckily, we can take the same healthcare analogy and realize that the way that doctors ask you about your health, they don't just ask you about how do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10, they ask you about your symptoms and the causes of your symptoms. What hurts? Your stomach. Did you eat something bad yesterday? And so we took that same idea and used it to think of the company as the body and it's potentially unhealthy. And we want to understand what clusters of symptoms are we seeing. So what we do is we invite people to use an online platform where they completely anonymously and confidentially share specific experiences of things that interfered with their ability to do their work. We don't ask about things that made you feel excluded because that's kind of loading the dice. We just want to say, tell me something that happened to you and then tell me what category it belongs in. And then tell me what was the source. Was it because of a policy in the company? Was it because of your leadership, your management, your HR department, your peers, and so on and so forth? And it turns out that armed with those two bits of data, we have qualitative and quantitative data, we get very powerful and actionable results. On the quantitative side, we have the categories, the sources, and the identity traits, and that tells us where are the biggest problems and opportunities. And on the qualitative side, we have experience descriptions that tell us exactly what is happening. And for those of you that have not been to one of my talks, I recommend there's videos of it. I do these fairly regularly. I show lots and lots of data where we can tell an individual company exactly where the problems are, why they're happening, and best of all, we can link them to their financial outcomes. So that's measuring inclusion. Now, the new part that I believe none of you have ever seen is how do you measure merit? And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, I want to remind you a little bit about this slide, right? Remember, we talked about the impact of promotion bias, right? Well, what is promotion bias? And this goes back to the question that was being asked before. What causes that bias in the promotion? It could be negative workplace experiences, like the ones that we measure when we measure inclusion. It could be my boss told me that I would be a happier person if I went to the gym twice a week. This, by the way, is an honest to goodness comment that somebody made. Or another comment of somebody that said, you know, I had just received the promotion, and during the celebration, one of my colleagues came up to me and said, the only reason you got this promotion is because you don't have anything between your legs. Okay, stuff like that happens all the time. Those things clearly have a negative impact on you. But it turns out that often the reason why we have these, what macroscopically look like these promotion biases, has to do not so much with interactions with people, but it has to do with inadequate or biased processes that impact many individuals. For example, if you have a very casual way of selecting clients or projects for your team members, because that is rife with the possibility for unconscious or conscious biases to have an impact on a lot of people. Or if your company uses an unstructured process to do performance reviews, or perhaps if you're not either purposefully or inadvertently, if you're not creating equal opportunity for people to access growth and development opportunities, if you will. So all of these kinds of biases are things that can have a significant impact on who is actually advancing and who is not, who's getting compensated and who's not getting compensated adequately. And so this requires a brief detour through the notion of biases, because I talk about the idea of these bias processes, but I realize that especially in the field of DEI, the notion of bias tends to manifest itself in two different ways. You often hear people talk about unconscious biases, and here's a definition that I got from, I don't know what website. Unconscious biases are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside of their own conscious awareness. You also sometimes hear people talking about structural biases, structural racism, structural sexism, and et cetera, et cetera. And these are defined as the normalized and legitimized range of policies, practices, and attitudes that routinely produce cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for minority populations. Now, in my humble opinion, and I have to say that's actually not a very humble opinion at all, it's probably a very arrogant opinion, both of these kinds of biases miss the point. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, let's look at unconscious biases. And unconscious biases, a few years ago, were sort of like the darling of the DI space. There's been a lot of research that shows that actually unconscious bias training does not work all that well. But I think that there is a more profound problem. First of all, unconscious biases, and I have a whole other talk that I give specifically about biases, in which I give examples of why unconscious biases are an absolutely unavoidable part of life. They're a part of how our brain works, and there's absolutely no way that you can get rid of unconscious biases. But it also turns out that on their own, many unconscious biases are relatively harmless, especially if they're not acted upon. As Philip Atiba Goff, the founder of the Policing Equity Center and a professor at Yale, he says in his TED Talk, he said, biases, discrimination is about behaviors, not about attitudes. If somebody has a bias, they have a bias. If it's an act on it, that it can be negative. And it turns out that, quite frankly, most of the harmful workplace biases that we have seen in our data are not unconscious. We hear stories about people being called expletives or being insulted, whatever. Those are not unconscious biases. And when you focus on unconscious biases, one of the things that's really frustrating is that it places the burden on individuals. Basically, you hear companies saying, you are bad. If only you could get rid of your unconscious biases, we would be in nirvana and we wouldn't have all these problems with DE&I. And that sucks, because you're basically telling people that it's their fault for something that they literally cannot control, and it's an integral part of who they are. So that's the problem with unconscious biases. But I also have a problem with when people talk about structural biases. Structural biases, by definition, can only be seen as differences in measured outcomes. So a structural bias is an outcome, it's not a cause. So when people say that something is caused by structural biases, it's a circular definition because you're saying, I am observing a phenomenon, and now I'm saying that that phenomenon that I'm observing is the cause of the observation of the phenomenon. So unless you can explain what is causing the problem, saying that the problem is because of a structural bias is not particularly useful. Because first of all, in fact, it's virtually impossible. It's incredibly difficult to see a structural bias in individual behaviors, which, by the way, this is exactly how the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action. This is exactly how these structural biases persist, is because you see in racial justice, for example, you look at the numbers, the disparities between how white people are treated and how black people are treated in this country. But you never see, oh, look, this judge said, I'm going to give you a lighter sentence because you're white. Well, maybe it has to do with their background and I know your dad or whatever the case might be, but it's incredibly difficult to pinpoint the structural phenomena to individual behaviors. And it's very, very, very difficult to understand the root causes of some of these structural biases. More importantly, what I found is that a lot of times it becomes a bit of a scapegoat. It's like, well, it's a structural bias. What can I do about it? I can't help it. Hey, it's because society is structured in a negative way against these people. And therefore, when they come to my company, they're not as qualified. It's not my problem. Okay. So with that, what I invite people to do is to think in a very different way about biases, and you will see how this leads to merit and how we measure it. I would submit to you that if you think about it from a systems perspective, if you think about what's going on in an organization that actually causes different people to have different experiences and different abilities to advance based on their merit, there are three kinds of biases that matter. We've already talked about the individual biases. So an example of that would be a white male manager that tends to assign more interesting projects to white male employees. There is such a thing as what I call contextual biases. I'm not sure if this is the real word. I kind of made it up, but there are factors that are external to the organization that create biases towards certain segments. An example might be if a corporate leader is invited to speak at an event where most attendees happen to be white men, there is a contextual bias that this corporate leader can do nothing about. Well, he may choose to, or she may choose not to go to that event, but it's outside of their control, the fact that there is a contextual bias. Or, some people say, oh, we're from Vermont, and in Vermont, we're mostly white people. There are not a lot of people of color. You could argue that's kind of a contextual bias, if you will. In between those, there is a whole host of biases that are called organizational biases. And these are the policies, processes, best practices, systems that either create a bias or allow individual biases to impact certain people. As an example of that, imagine a company that only recruits from Ivy League colleges. Well, clearly, if you're only going to recruit from Ivy League schools, you're going to be essentially imposing a bias on your company because you're choosing to take a biased sample of the population. And what I'm going to submit to you is that organizational biases are the worst. These are particularly harmful because they allow individual biases to impact large numbers of individuals. One person being a jerk is bad. A person who is a jerk, who is a manager in charge of promotions and uses his jerkiness unchecked to make decisions is a much, much, much bigger problem. And so when we look at biases and we think about the differences between individual and organizational, it's important to think about the impact that it has on people and how they operate differently, right? So this was an article from a few years ago about a lawsuit against Tesla, where at their Fremont factory, they were sued by some Black employees. And one of the employees described, Aaron Craven, described how when he clocked into work every day at the Tesla Fremont factory, he knew that he might hear or be called the N-word. And when he walked into the bathroom stalls, he knew that he might see graffiti of KKK or swastikas, okay? Now, if you think about what I told you about individual versus organizational biases, these individual biases are, first of all, not unconscious. Anybody that tells me that it's unconscious bias to call somebody the N-word, I'm sorry, but that's not unconscious at all, right? Or drawing swastikas on a bathroom, that's not unconscious. That led Aaron Craven to feel disrespected doing his work. But the organizational biases, it would allow these exclusionary behaviors to impact large numbers of people. And when they, in that article, they had an interview with somebody very high up at Tesla, whose comment was, our company has more than 10,000 employees in the Fremont factory alone, so it is not humanly possible to stop all bad contact. This is exactly what I was talking about before when I say don't focus on individual biases. It's putting the onus on the wrong target, which is the individual people. And Tesla made the assumption that this was an individual bias issue. So how do we actually detect and manage organizational biases? And I have a whole other talk where I go into a lot of details, but in reality, it's really, really quite simple. What you should do is that you should look for disparities in outcomes across all the policies, processes, and systems that you manage. So if you're a manager of an organization and you're in charge of hiring committees, you're in charge of promotions, you're in charge of training, you're in charge of compensation, whatever you're in charge of, it could be just that you're in charge of who gets software to do their work. What you can do is to track the people that are going through those processes, those policies, and those systems systematically and check to see if there are disparities in the outcomes. If you see that some groups, and coincidentally, the white group in this particular case is the biggest one, right? But if you see that some group is maybe they're getting their performance reviews faster than other groups, maybe they're getting overall more positive performance reviews, maybe they're the ones that are assigned more projects. If you see that that's the case, then it means that you have created a disparity, and that disparity in outcome is not good. That's essentially an organizational bias. And it turns out that and I've proposed, and I've actually done activities with a couple of companies where we're starting to do this, where we explain to them how they can spot these kinds of biases, both qualitatively by auditing their processes, and then how they can very easily put in quantitative things in place to start tracking some of these effects that they might be seeing. And in particular, we realize that there are different mechanisms for these biases to influence the policies, processes, and I say sometimes PPS because it's a lot of words, policies, processes, or systems. You may have a PPS itself that is biased. For example, I'm going to hire people from Ivy League schools only. That's actually a biased policy. Or you may have a process or a policy that allows individual biases to impact outcomes for multiple individuals. For example, if you have casual performance reviews that are not structured, then you're allowing the individual biases to impact a whole bunch of people. And then the third kind is that there may be a situation in which you should have a policy, and the fact that you don't is creating a bias and a negative outcome. The Tesla example I gave you earlier is a perfect example. That company should have had a policy that says that if you are accused once of calling somebody the N-word, you're going to be put on probation. And if you do it twice, your ass is going to get fired. The fact that Tesla was lacking a system and a process to recognize, acknowledge, measure, and react to those kinds of bias behaviors is a massive organizational bias that they need to fix. But it manifests itself in a weird way because it's actually the lack of a process. So once you understand that, once you understand these ideas, you can create a safe process for employees to report negative experiences or observe biases. And measuring inclusion, the way I mentioned earlier, is one way that you can actually start to see, because sometimes people complain about things like, yeah, my manager told me that I should go to the gym twice a week. But other times you see things like, my manager has refused to give me a performance review for the last 7 months, or my manager keeps holding meetings and forgetting to invite me. When you see things like that, that starts to tell you, oh, here's a process that needs to be improved. Let's make it more systematic how we do performance reviews. Let's make it more systematic how people get invited to meetings. You can then audit your policies, processes, and systems to see where biases may influence outcomes. I've done an interactive activity as part of an exercise that I've done now with 3, 4, 2, whatever different companies, where I literally get people to sit around among themselves, like tables, or if it's online, it's breakout rooms, and say, okay, talk about things that you all manage and see if you can come up based on what I told you with specific ways that some of your processes may be biased. And you would be amazed. Like in one day, in a 1-hour session with a 20-minute exercise, one company found something like 35 processes that they could tell were biased. And then, of course, you have to measure the outcomes, because until you can qualitatively at least stop some of the bigger biases, But if you then have any data that you can use, and we don't need to boil the ocean down. Start with places you already are tracking. Look at compensation, look at performance reviews, look at promotion rates, look at who's getting mentoring. Track all of that. And then if you find that you're not giving the same outcomes to different groups, it means that you're creating an inequity. So if you think back about this picture that I gave you earlier about the idea that there is a problem with these biased processes, it leads to a very interesting question. What would you call an organization that had no disparities? If it looked like this, where the three people are the same on the left or the right, what do you call that kind of organization? I'll tell you exactly what you call it. It's a meritocracy. So this is how what I've been describing here is, and Tiffany, it's okay, I see you have to jump off. What I've been describing to you, this idea of finding these organizational biases, what you're really doing is you're measuring merit. And that's how you create a meritocracy. You measure outcomes across policies, processes, and systems. And when you find inequities or inequalities, if you want to call them that, eliminate them, which is a much easier and more appealing target than setting representation targets at different levels of the organization. This simply says, go back to here, measure, and if you see a disparity, figure out why and eliminate the disparity. Who's going to argue against that? Who's going to say, oh, no, that's unfair. That's an ideology. That's discriminating against white people. So to wrap up, and I realize that this is, it's the first time that I present all of this work together, and it's very difficult to cram all of this in an hour. But I want to just summarize what I hope you're going to take away from this presentation, which is that in this framework, inclusion is still a crucial piece because it's about measuring workplace experiences, not feelings. And we know how to measure it. We've been doing it for years now at Aleria, and we believe that we're getting some amazing data that can really help companies understand what they can do better, where they need to, and where they need to focus. Merit is sort of at the next level up. It's about outcomes, about your processes, policies, and systems, and ensuring that those outcomes are based on your skills and your performance and not on your identity. And a true meritocracy knows how to measure and demonstrate equity in all processes and systems that impact its worker. In other words, you see what I'm doing here, right? I'm paying lip service. Well, it's really more than paying lip service. I'm acknowledging the complaints of the people that have criticized DEI. I'm acknowledging the fact that equity in a vacuum, when it's not explained properly, can seem like the wrong thing. I'm acknowledging the fact that these people really cared about meritocracy, but I'm also acknowledging the fact that it's not enough to open your mouth and say meritocracy. You actually have to measure it. And that it's not enough to measure processes. You also have to measure the experiences of individuals. You need to understand what is actually happening. And efficiency fits in very well because, if we said the MIMP, then it would be the MIMP framework, which doesn't sound nearly as good. But we thought the MIME framework is kind of a good acronym, but also it pays lip service to, this is definitely paying lip service to the fact that we now have a Department of Government Efficiency, and what they're doing is really nothing but efficiency, but it's recognizing that efficiency is one aspect of performance, and it really needs to be linked to financial outcomes. You cannot just wave your hands and say, oh, we're going to have greater efficiency by firing half of our workers. I want to finish with one comment because I know that a lot of you are working in DI and probably care about this. You may have noticed a severe absence of the word diversity from this presentation. But I want to explain to you why, and if this is something that even when I was working just on inclusion, I was often getting said, well, does that mean that you don't care about diversity? I do care about diversity. And in my talks, I've talked about why sometimes we focus on diversity, maybe in a way that is not as meaningful as it should be. But I want to point out something very important. Diversity and efficiency are both what I call emergent outcomes. This has to do with my background in studying complex systems. If you have a company that is the collection of its people, you can measure its performance or efficiency. A CEO cares about that. You can also measure its diversity. The head of DI, the head of HR will care about diversity. Those two things both exist at the same time. One of them does not eliminate the other. The desire to focus on performance and efficiency does not mean that we don't desire diversity. And more importantly, what I've argued many times before in my talks about inclusion, I firmly do not believe and have a ton of data and research to argue that it is not diversity itself that drives performance. It's a more inclusive and equitable environment that leads to higher diversity and higher performance. So if we do the right thing, we can pay lip service, not pay lip service, we can pay attention to what they want. They want to know about how to make more money. So let's figure out, how do we do the right things in a company that will make more money for them and will achieve the goals that we want of a true meritocracy with greater diversity. So again, I'm sorry I kind of went through basically 5 talks that I've given in the past, plus some new things, and combine them all into 1 hour. But I hope you might be interested in coming. The next webinar is going to be on June 4th. It's the one that I was supposed to do on April 10th. And that one just simply looks at a whole bunch of misconceptions, and I debunk a bunch of misconceptions about diversity, equity, inclusion. Another thing that Cynthia and I have had a lot of conversations about. And then I also want to let you know that DIRC, which, well, it stands for Diversity and Inclusion Research Conference, but this year we may strategically not say what it stands for, but it's been DIRC for 8 years now. So DIRC 2025, we're about to announce the date is going to be October 30th. It will be online only. If any of your organization wants to be a partner or a sponsor, please let me know. We're going to be announcing this very soon. And so with that, thank you very much. Here is a few links. If you enjoyed the presentation, say a few things about it on LinkedIn. You can tag me or maybe repost one of the posts that I made that you might have seen on LinkedIn, because the more we get the word out, the happier I will be. That's assuming, of course, that you enjoyed it. And if you hated it, go ahead and say negative things about it. That's perfectly okay. So I'm sorry we're almost at time. I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions, engage into any discussions. And other than that, really enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for sharing your time with me. And I'll stick around for a few minutes. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing you in the future at one of the other